When I was a little kid, my father drove a station wagon. It was one of those big, long station wagons that had the fake wood on the side. Remember those? That was our family car. And my brother and I, when we were little, we loved to sit at the back of the station wagon on long road trips. And we would stare out the back window and we would wave to the drivers in the cars behind us. My father would be zooming down the highway, and there we were, just hanging out at the back with no seatbelts on. Now, nobody thought my parents were bad parents for allowing us to sit back there, and no cop ever pulled us over to give us a ticket. That's just the way things were back then. And back when I was little, teachers at our school, the nuns at the Catholic school, would routinely discipline students by smacking us with a ruler on the behind. Now, again, no one thought these nuns were bad teachers, and no one reported them for abuse. That's just the way things were. And when I got bullied at school and I went to the principal, she said, "Boys will be boys, just suck it up." Now, today, of course, we'd be outraged by those things. If you were on the highway and you saw kids hanging out at the back of a car with no seatbelts or in a car seat, you'd probably report it. If you saw a teacher smack a student, you would probably report it. If you heard about a principal who told a student who was bullied to just suck it up, you'd probably be outraged because the world is different today. I think about when I'm sure many of you remember that people could smoke in public places. People smoked in restaurants and on airplanes. When I was in high school, we actually had in our school a smoking lounge for the students. And it all seems so crazy right now. But that was just in my lifetime. In my lifetime, businessmen would drink during the workday. Many of them actually had bars in their office next to their desks. They would go out to business lunches where they would have cocktails and smoke cigars in the middle of the workday. And they would flirt with their secretaries, calling them sweetie and honey and worse. Okay. Now, all of these things, of course, today are unacceptable and inappropriate. So how did we get from there to here in such a short period of time? How did all of those changes happen in just my lifetime? Well, those things changed because we changed. Believe it or not, we are evolving as a species. Okay? The human race is evolving. We are. We are awakening in consciousness. We're awakening to new ways of seeing, new ways of understanding, new ways of being. And as we change, the world changes. As we evolve, the world around us evolves. We, my friends, have been creating a new world, a new earth. Now, I share all of this with you today because that's what the readings from the lectionary today are all about. As we heard in the Old Testament reading from the book of Isaiah, there is a creation of a new heaven and a new earth that is taking place. It's continually taking place. And in our New Testament reading from Luke's Gospel, we hear that Jesus talks about how old things are being passed away so that all things can be made new. As we heard from that reading, the disciples are in the temple and they're admiring its beauty. And Jesus tells them, this is all going to be thrown down. Now, Jesus is not talking literally. He's not talking about the physical structure. He's talking about structures symbolically. That old structures, old ways of thinking, old ways of understanding, old ways of being must come crumbling down in order for this newness, this new life to begin. So that made me think, when they were looking around the temple, it made me think of this structure, our structure, Douglas UCC. Many of you know that this church is 137 years old. It's one of the most historic structures in Saugatuck and Douglas. In the pews that you're sitting in right now, the people who were here in 1882 sat in those very same exact pews, which I think is amazing. Okay? Now, back then in 1882, when this church first started, slavery had only recently been abolished, and women could not vote. In fact, it would be almost another 40 years before they could vote. So I think about those people sitting here in 1882, how they would never be able to comprehend or conceive that someday there would be a black president of the United States, or that women would serve at high levels of public office. They wouldn't have been able to conceive that. They wouldn't have been able to wrap their heads around the fact that on this very altar where I'm standing, the altar where many of them got married, that someday same-sex couples would be married on this altar legally. They would not have been able to comprehend that one day their little church in Douglas, Michigan, would have a woman pastor or an openly gay pastor. But here we are. Now, in the span of human history, 137 years is a very small amount of time. We have created a new world in just that short amount of time, a world that those people could never have considered. How did all that happen? You made it happen. You did. There are people sitting in this church who took to the streets in the 1960s for the civil rights movement, anti-war movements. There are people in this church today who were there in the 1970s for the women's liberation movement. There are people in the 80s and 90s who fought for gay liberation, gay rights. And in the 5 years that I've been the pastor here, I've been witness to so many of you taking to the streets against gun violence and climate change. We are living at a time of great change and transformation, and that's an exciting thing. So why do so many of us feel so dejected? Well, it's what Jesus is telling the disciples here in today's gospel. This creating of this new earth is not going to be easy. There's going to be much discord and destruction and even death. Think about those movements I spoke about that you were a part of. Those were struggles. People died so that more and more of us could be free. And that's what Jesus is telling the disciples here, that as they work to create this new world, they're going to be persecuted. They're going to have to go through a lot of struggle and strife. But that is part of the process of creating the new earth. And that's why he's telling them, do not be afraid. It is just part of the process. Now, I mentioned at the top of the service how the Advent devotional this year is called A New Earth. That also happens to be the name of a best-selling book by Eckhart Tolle, which was published about 10 years ago. And at that time, Oprah Winfrey devoted a whole week of shows with Eckhart Tolle, the writer of the book. And an excerpt from that book was our words of integration and guidance this morning that Sue read for us. And as Eckhart Tolle says in that book, the old structures do not want to die. And so they will do everything they can to hold on and to maintain that ego, that separation, that duality. And in that excerpt from his book, Eckhart Tolle writes this about those egoic structures. He says, the ego strengthens itself by emphasizing the otherness of the other. The ego needs an enemy for its continued survival, hence its refusal to compromise. The egoic state of consciousness, which is still more prevalent than the awakened consciousness, will likely become increasingly dysfunctional and cause a growing number of acute crises affecting many parts of the planet. To some extent, that's already happening. This is nothing to be afraid of. Acute crises and dysfunction always precede or coincide with any evolutionary advancement or gain in consciousness. It is a necessary precursor for the next stage of human evolution, which is the awakening of consciousness and the arising of a new earth. That is what I think Jesus was trying to tell the disciples in today's gospel. There is going to be a lot of suffering and strife, but do not be afraid. It is just part of the process. This needs to happen. These old structures need to fall in order for there to be this renewal of the face of the earth. Now, we as Christians today, 2,000 years later, we are still called to follow that same way. Jesus is calling us to renew the face of the earth, to bring about the kingdom of heaven on earth. Jesus is not coming back to do that for us. We are being called to bring about the kingdom of heaven here on earth, and we've been doing it. Now, we may not see it in our lifetime in this incarnation, but we have been and we are a part of this process of evolution. Think about it. The people that sat in this church 137 years ago, they were not as evolved as we are today. So can you imagine 137 years from now what the people of Douglas UCC will be like? I think it's incredible. And that's why I said I know that there is a lot of struggle right now and you may feel dejected. But I want you to shift your thinking and to say how amazing it is that we are living at this time of great change and transformation. So, let us go forth. Let us not be afraid, for we were made for such a time as this, and we are the ones that we've been waiting for. Namaste.